Hi, everybody. This is Francisco Gil White. I want to welcome all of our followers on our YouTube English channel. We are beginning a series of live podcasts, live streams on our English channel, which we hadn't been doing, but now we're going to be doing it every week. Management of Reality will have a podcast on Monday at noon Mexico City time, which is Chicago time, every Monday. So please tune in, come back every Monday. We will be here for you, giving you exciting new commentary on the stuff we're doing, on what we're publishing, and all sorts of things that we think are important to interpret the world that we're in. Today, we're going to be talking about Rabbi Hillel, because he is very important, and I think often not properly understood. Especially, he is not understood in context, and in particular, he is not understood in the context of the controversies that engulfed the Jewish community in the first century, particularly after Jesus of Nazareth began preaching his own message in the generation after Hillel. So I think this is going to be a topic that's very interesting to Christians and Jews. In other words, to the entire Western civilization. For this has to do with the roots of ethics in Western civilization. And I want to welcome my friend Yoel Katz, who's here, gonna help us by generating his own questions, and also by relaying to me your questions, so that we can have an interesting conversation about these topics. Now, I'll be very excited to hear your questions. So Yoel, welcome our audience.
Thank you so much, Francisco. A pleasure to be here and very excited for this topic.
Fantastic. Yoel, you're from Uruguay, correct? From what city in Uruguay are you?
I'm from the capital, Montevideo.
From Montevideo. All right, fantastic. Yoel is our chief of staff at Management of Reality. He's our network expert. He's the one who uploads oversees the whole process of uploading our videos and subtitling them and making them beautiful and all that stuff. We have a whole team there, but Yoel directs them. So the first thing I'm going to do, Yoel, is I'm going to share my screen so that people can see where this is. So I want you to see. So this is Management of Reality. This is our. There we can see the live, right? But what I want them to see is the article. I want you to see. So this, I guess that's not possible then. I can't do that. I can't show. Oh, here it is. So if you go to management, to our Substack, right? You will see. And how do you get to our Substack? I'll show you. You just go to managementofreality.com or franciscogilwhite.com. It's the same thing. If you need English, you can switch to English up here. And the second button takes you to our articles. So you click on that. And the article we just published is this one right here. This one, called Rabbi Hillel the Elder, the Love Revolution in Ancient Judaism and the Ethical Core of Western Civilization. The image here this is a detail of the Knesset menorah. So there's a giant menorah outside the Knesset in Jerusalem. The Knesset is the parliament of the Jewish state. Beit Knesset in Hebrew originally just means synagogue, but the parliament in the Jewish state in Jerusalem has been called the Knesset as well. So in the Knesset, outside the Knesset, there's a gigantic stone menorah carved in bas-relief. And one of the details in the bas-relief of that giant menorah is this image here, which shows us Rabbi Hillel. I'm going to make it a little bigger. That's Rabbi Hillel teaching a pagan who is standing on one foot. You can see that right there. This is a representation of a very, very famous story that you can find in the Talmud. The Talmud is the body of work that contains the most important Jewish jurisprudence. Okay, so jurisprudence can be understood as the philosophy of law on the one hand, but it can also be understood in a slightly different meaning as the institutionalized system by which legal decisions are reached that then have the weight of precedent for future legal disputations, right? So in every legal tradition that treats legal disputations that produce conclusions and then become precedent, right, for the future. In any legal tradition that has that structure, what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out how to apply the basic principles, the basic constitutional principles, which in Jewish tradition are contained in the Torah. You want to figure out how to apply that to the everyday problems of daily life that are encountered in your specific in your specific historical context. How do you translate the abstract principles of constitutional law into secondary laws that help you decide court cases that arise in everybody's daily life, right? That's what jurisprudence is doing. And the Talmud is the origin of Jewish jurisprudence. And the most important figure in that entire tradition of Jewish jurisprudence is this guy, Rabbi Hillel. Okay? Why? Because his opinions are the basis of the Mishnah, which is the first part of the Talmud. And that's where the basic interpretive edifice and the basic orientation of Torah interpretation to produce legal decisions was established. Okay, so before the Mishnah was written, the Jewish sages were transmitting these legally binding decisions orally. But once they wrote the Mishnah, Jewish jurisprudence continued as a written tradition. Okay, they still call it the oral law, but starting with the Mishnah, it becomes an actual written tradition. Okay, and the story that's represented here is very important because in the generation of Rabbi Hillel and the generation that followed, there was a huge controversy in the Jewish community about proper interpretation of the Torah to produce secondary law. Okay? There was a huge controversy about how Jewish jurisprudence should be done. And there were two main schools of thought. One was identified with the work of Rabbi Hillel, and the other one was identified with the work of Rabbi Shammai. Okay, so these were the two main schools of thought. And Rabbi Shammai was the establishment. Okay, Rabbi Hillel was the upstart. So Rabbi Shammai was the second in command at the Sanhedrin, which was a kind of a Supreme Court and the kind of government rolled up into one. It was like a parliament in a sense, and the Supreme Court, and it produced binding law and also religious interpretation. So it was very, very important. And Rabbi Shammai was initially the second in command at the Sanhedrin, and then he became the Nasi, or the head of the Sanhedrin. So the school of Shammai, the school of interpretation that Shammai led, was the establishment. They were in control of the most important institution. Rabbi Hillel was the upstart, the revolutionary, the one who was challenging the mode of interpretation that had become established in Jewish society. So what were they saying? Well, Rabbi Shammai, so Rabbi Shammai was more of a rigorist. Okay, so I have a paragraph here that will. So here we go. Rabbi Shammai tended toward rigorous, strict, inflexible, and literal interpretations, whereas Rabbi Hillel prioritized the ethical spirit and humane application of the law. Thus, where Shammai's rulings emphasized precision, discipline, and legal stringency, Hillel's rulings often aimed at mercy, tolerance, and practical compassion. Okay, so, and in the generations that followed Shammai and Hillel, the community of rabbis resolved this controversy in favor of Hillel. Okay, so the story we see represented in, I will now tell you the story represented in this bas-relief, which tells us something of the differences between Shammai and Hillel. So what does this very famous story say? It says that this pagan, this guy right here, came up. What does a pagan mean? A pagan is a polytheist, right? A pagan is a non-Jew, someone who doesn't worship within monotheism, someone who has many gods and doesn't know the God of Israel, right? That's a pagan, a non-Jew. So the pagan comes up to Rabbi Shammai first, not this guy, but the rival, Rabbi Shammai, and he poses a challenge to Rabbi Shammai. He says, and the nature of the challenge is, hey, I will convert to Judaism if you can teach me Judaism while I stand on one foot. Okay, so you can't stand on one foot for a very long time. So the challenge was, can the rabbi condense the essence, if you will, the grammatical essence of Judaism into one compact statement? That was the challenge. And the story goes like this, as I'm quoting from the Talmud here. There was another occasion involving a Gentile or non-Jew who came before Shammai and said to him, "Convert me on condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot." And so an annoyed Shammai pushed him aside with the builder's cubit, a stick that is used in construction, that was in his hand. The Gentile then came before Hillel, who converted him. Hillel said to him, "What is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it." Okay, so what is this story telling us? Well, first of all, the story is telling us of a difference in temperament between Shammai and Hillel, right? Shammai was annoyed by the pagan's challenge. Hillel was inspired by the pagan's challenge, right? And so it speaks to a difference in personality that the authors of the Talmud are trying to capture in this story. And the other thing that's very important is that Hillel successfully replies to the pagan's challenge. Okay, so Hillel says, look, everything that Judaism is trying to do is to figure out how one human can love another human the same way that he or she loves him or herself. Okay? So this is, if you will, the atomic core, the irreducible core, and also you might call it the grammatical generative principle for all Jewish thought, for all Jewish ethical and legal thought. So basically what Hillel is saying is, look, what we do in Judaism is we try to produce laws that will be consistent with this ethical principle. And this is the stick by which you have to measure any legal conclusion in Judaism. So if you reach a legal conclusion that contradicts loving your neighbor as you love yourself, then you know you're getting into trouble. Okay? You have to hew to this principle, and if you're doing that, that's Judaism. The rest, all the books that we have written, says Rabbi Hillel, all the literature and the legal press and the legal conclusions that we reach and so on, that's just commentary, right? It's a development on this foundational generative grammatical principle. Okay? Now, you have a question up to here, Yoel, or should I continue?
Yes, I have a question if you want to answer now or later, but
Sure,
it's
go
the
ahead.
following. You said Shammai is like the establishment because it was like the Beit Din, the Sanhedrin.
He was
right? Like
initially the Av Beit Din, which was the second in command at the Sanhedrin, and then later in life he became the Nasi, or the head of the Sanhedrin.
Okay, great. And you said if you can profound a little bit in this aspect, as Hillel was like the little guy who was in the upstairs, like he didn't have a name, he didn't like, it was like that. It was if you can profound a little bit in that matter to understand a little bit better.
You mean Rabbi Hillel? Well, so Rabbi Hillel became very influential, but he was not. His school was not in control of the institutions. That it was Beit Shammai that had more influence over institutional life in Judaism. Okay, so Hillel was trying to change Jewish institutional life, and this became a very big controversy. And that controversy was eventually resolved in favor of Beit Hillel. So it was not resolved immediately. I'm going to talk about this in a second. The whole first century was the working out of this controversy within the community. By the end of the first century, and certainly in the second, it was, but the rabbis were reaching a consensus in favor of Beit Hillel. So Beit Hillel was becoming more and more popular among the rabbis, and it was gaining more and more adherents. And the consensus in favor of Beit Hillel, crystallizes in the second century, so that by the early third century, which is when the Mishnah is written, they were all agreed. And that's why they wrote the Mishnah to justify Hillel's conclusions as binding legal precedent. And that became the sort of the foundation stone for all of Jewish jurisprudence, which therefore means that thanks to Rabbi Hillel, love your brother as you love yourself, love your neighbor as you love yourself, became the foundation principle for all of Jewish legal, ethical, and legal work.
Okay. Perfect. Yes.
All right. Now, once you understand this context, which outside of Judaism, most people really don't have any clue about, and even among Jews, it's not that well understood, because a lot of Jews don't necessarily read too much into their own religion. But Orthodox Jews, of course, know Rabbi Hillel very well, because he's obviously the most influential rabbi of all time, right? So he's the foundation for all of Jewish jurisprudence, and therefore all of rabbinical Judaism, which is the form of Judaism that survived historically. So that makes Rabbi Hillel the most influential rabbi of all time. And if you think rabbinical Judaism is a good thing, as I do, then that makes Rabbi Hillel perhaps the greatest Jew in all of history. So now, once you understand this historical context, it becomes very interesting to talk about Jesus, because Jesus appears in the generation immediately after Rabbi Hillel. So Rabbi Hillel is a figure from the first century before Jesus. He dies in the year, according to our sources, he dies in the year 10 of the first century. Okay, so according to the latest scholarship on the birth of Jesus, Jesus was born in the year 4, not in the year 1. So that would mean that Jesus was only 6 years old when Rabbi Hillel died. Now, why is this chronology so important? Because a lot of people believe, because we live in a Christian civilization, and the Christian tradition has transmitted the memory that it was Jesus who gave us this message, that we, should love our neighbor as we love ourselves. That's in the Christian understanding. This is supposed to be an innovation from Jesus, and that's how most Christians understand it. This is certainly how I understood it when I was growing up as a young Catholic. So I was sure that Jesus was the first one to say that, and the reason I believe that is that the Catholics around me would the adults from which I learned my religion would say that Jesus was the first to say this. And the reason they said that is that the grandparental generation had taught that to them. It's a tradition. It keeps getting passed down, but we've all been wrong. We've all been wrong about this. It's not, Jesus was not the first to make this, into a big message. It was Hillel. Now, it's certainly true that Jesus repeated this. So if you, let me just share my screen again. So if we go back to my essay, I'll show you here. Here's what Jesus said. So at one point they asked Jesus, "Hey, Rabbi, which is the great commandment in the law?" In other words, what's the most important commandment? And Jesus said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as you love yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets." Okay? So Jesus is saying the same thing as Hillel, right? In Jewish religious talk, any reference to the law is first and foremost to the law of Moses, which is to say the Torah. Now, Jesus adds "and the prophets," but that's not really a disagreement. What he's saying is that the Jewish normative tradition, as exemplified by the exhortations of the prophets, is consistent with these two commandments that Jesus considers jointly generative, right, for all of Judaism. And the second of these is the one that Hillel invokes, right? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus is agreeing with Hillel. He's not saying something new. He is agreeing. Now you may think, well, he is saying something new because he's putting "love the Lord your God" first. But notice there is no hierarchy between these. He says, "and a second is like it." And then he says, "On these two commandments depend the law and the prophets." So he considers them both equally important and generative for all of Judaism. So he is in basic agreement with Hillel. And in fact, in a different place, Jesus considers love your neighbor by itself as the most important commandment. as the commandment that is the generative commandment for all of Judaism. He says, and this is in Matthew, he says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So in both cases, in Hillel, and notice he's not saying here that you have to love the Lord. He's not putting it in front or before loving your neighbor, right? He omits it completely. So it really does appear that Jesus agrees with Hillel. Now, both Hillel and Jesus are paraphrasing Leviticus 19:18. Okay? Leviticus 19:18, I have it up here, says, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's what Leviticus 19:18 says. And one way to say that is, as Rabbi Hillel says, whatever you hate, don't do it to your neighbor. That's one way of loving your neighbor as yourself, right? You ask yourself, well, what do I hate? I won't do that to my neighbor. In a different kind of methodological strategy is the one that Jesus gives you here. He says, look, whatever you want however you would like other people to treat you, whatever it is that you prefer others to do to you, then you do that to them, right? So they're both asking you to do introspection. What is it that you hate? Don't do that to your neighbor. What is it that you prefer? Do that to your neighbor. Okay. In both cases, you introspect. It gives you a method so that you can love your neighbor as yourself. So they're in very, very close agreement. They're both paraphrasing Leviticus 19:18, love your neighbor as yourself, to help us be better people, to help us be ethical, right? But given that they agree, you might think, well, then who should we give the credit for this? Well, obviously, it has to go to Rabbi Hillel, because Rabbi Hillel came first, right? Rabbi Hillel, a first century before Jesus, obviously comes in the first century because Jesus reordered the Western calendar. So what this means, once you put this in context, is that Jesus was born in the middle of this huge controversy between Beit Hillel, or the school of Hillel, and Beit Shammai, or the school of Shammai. Jesus grew up in the middle of that controversy, which had not been settled yet. Jesus became a preacher. So what this context tells you is that Jesus was obviously a follower of Hillel. He was one of the many rabbis who were excited by Hillel's message and who were trying to challenge the rabbinical establishment to adopt the legal conclusions of Rabbi Hillel as the basis for Judaism. And as I was saying earlier, this is a movement that succeeded. And in the second century, the consensus was reached. And that's why in the early third century, when the Mishnah was finally written, it is Rabbi Hillel's opinions that become the foundation for Jewish jurisprudence. Seems like you have another question, Yuval.
Yes, I have another question because I'm connecting more right now with my Judaism roots, and I'm learning more. And Hillel the elder is someone who I didn't very much knew for a long time. But for example, Maimonides, yes. And I remember one phrase that you told us in another live was like, from Moses to Moses, no one like Moses, right? That's a very common and very famous phrase. And where Hillel goes here, like the question is, to simplify it, is Hillel versus Maimonides are very different. They are very special in their own character, I believe, of course. But why do you say, I believe that you're saying Hillel was very much more influential by far than Maimonides? Why is Maimonides, I believe, is much more mentioned than Hillel, in my view?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. I'm also a fan of Moses Maimonides. So I don't feel like I have to choose between them. But if the question you want to resolve is who's the greatest rabbi, who's the most profound rabbi of all time, many rabbis would choose Moses Maimonides. This is true, because he was so Moses Maimonides was he cannot be repeated. He's just too fantastic. So he was the greatest rabbi of his generation, right? The greatest Aristotelian philosopher of his generation. He was a great scientist. So, for example, he was an internationally famous experimental physician, a medical doctor. He was an astronomer, a mathematician. I mean, and he did two things that are eternally important. He wrote a book called Mishneh Torah, which was a compendium of all Jewish law, organized by topic, so that it would be easy to consult and in an easy to read Hebrew, because the Talmud is very difficult to read. So Mishneh Torah, which is Maimonides' compilation of Jewish law, is meant to be easy to consult, easy to read, so that everybody knows their rights and their obligations. He decided many controversies, extant controversies, according to his own judgment, and that became very important because let us say the body of Jewish law, as it is still utilized today, is based on the Shulchan Aruch by Joseph Caro, and the basis of the Shulchan Aruch is Mishneh Torah by Moses Maimonides. So Maimonides was very, very influential as a giver of Jewish law, but he was also very influential as a philosopher who rationally explained why Jewish law is superior to other legal traditions, right? So what he is doing in another book that he wrote, which is called The Guide to the Perplexed, he is performing a kind of an Aristotelian project. His goal is to show you that from a completely rational perspective, if you want to live in peace, then what you need is Jewish law. Okay, it's a rational project, and it's very important. It's very, very smart, and it was very influential with Catholic thinkers, because Thomas Aquinas, who revolutionized the thinking of the priests, who were the Western intellectuals, he was very influenced by Moses Maimonides and the Guide to the Perplexed. So yes, Moses Maimonides, and I know that I have often said this, I think he's the most important human that ever lived, because without Moses Maimonides, we wouldn't have modern Western civilization. But I think it is fair to point out that without Hillel, you can't have Moses Maimonides. You see, you can't, because Moses Maimonides comes out of the culture of the Talmud, and the Talmud is based on Hillel. So I think one can have the opinion, one can reasonably have the opinion that Moses Maimonides is the most profound rabbi of all time, the most profound Jewish philosopher of all time. I think that's a reasonable opinion. But the most influential rabbi of all time, I think that goes to Hillel. I think that goes to Hillel. Right?
Nice.
And they're both towering figures. We don't have to choose between them. They're both towering figures that they changed the world.
Okay, that's nice. No, the question was not to choose one, absolutely, but the question also, that's one question that you answer, but then other one is maybe a theory of yours. Why is not so mentioned, Hillel? Because I don't think so much important.
Oh, you know what? I'm not sure why.
Okay.
I mean, he does get mentioned a lot in in the Jewish religious context because he is the great hero of the Mishnah. So in an Orthodox context, he does get mentioned a lot. But if you're only just now connecting with Judaism, then it makes sense that you would hear about him less than about Maimonides. I think that makes sense because the fact that Hillel is the foundation stone of Jewish rabbinical Judaism, of Jewish jurisprudence, means that sometimes he gets taken for granted a little bit. He became established. Beit Hillel became established. I think my suspicion is once he became established, you kind of don't want to talk about the controversies that existed before. I mean, you kind of people want to be able to kind of project the interpretation that this is just what Judaism is, not that this is the consequence of a revolution in Jewish thought, which is in fact what happened. Of course, Hillel was saying this is what Judaism really is. He was saying that, and the rabbis agreed with him in the end. But there was a controversy, and there was an entire school saying, no, Judaism has to be this other thing. So I think it might be uncomfortable for the rabbis of the generations that came after Hillel to put too much emphasis on the fact that there had been a controversy, because it's unsettling to present history as the history of Judaism as a combative arena where the fundamentals were at one point not agreed upon. That's awkward. Yeah. So maybe that's the reason that this whole context is not discussed as much. Maybe. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this question that you asked me, but that would be my first guess. Okay. That would be my first guess.
That's interesting. Yeah. Francisco.
Yeah. So anyway, coming. Let me just come back to Jesus for a second, and then I'll field your next question. So I want to come back to Jesus because once you understand the historical context and you realize that in the lifetime of Jesus, this controversy had not been settled among the rabbis. And once you realize that Jesus was talking like a disciple of Hillel, the entire message of Jesus is that we have to be more compassionate, we have to be more forgiving, less severe, right? All of that is entirely consistent with Hillel's teachings. And also, Jesus was teaching his followers, according to what we see in the Gospels, he was teaching his followers to reduce all of Judaism to the grammatic generative commandment. Love your neighbor as you love yourself, precisely in the manner that Hillel also did before Jesus, right? So all of that suggests that Jesus was preaching within Hillel's movement, that he was one of many rabbis who were defending Hillel's conclusions against Beit Shammai, against the establishment, trying to change the nature and the structure of Judaism. And you see echoes in the Gospels. You see echoes of this controversy between Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel, between the school of Rabbi Shammai and the school of Rabbi Hillel, because the Gospels represent Jesus as if he were the only member of Beit Hillel. So the Gospels represent Jesus as the only one who's talking about love. And according to the Gospels, the entire community of rabbis was against him. And they were all rigorists, severe rigorists in the mold of Beit Shammai. This is how the Gospels represent it. They don't represent a contest between two big movements within the Jewish community. They represent it as though Jesus was the only representative of the love school of Beit Hillel's message of love, and the entire rabbinic community was against Jesus's message. That's how the gospel is represented. And the reason for that representation is that, you see, the Jesus movement became almost uniformly a Greek movement. Most Jews did not follow Jesus. In the Gospels, you see the representation is that most Jews did not follow Jesus because they were rejecting the messianic claim, right? They were rejecting the idea that Jesus was the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, and also rejecting the message of love that Jesus was bringing. Both things, right? Now, it makes a lot of sense to say that most Jews rejected the messianic claim for Jesus. That makes a lot of sense. Why? Because in Jewish tradition, which comes from the book of Isaiah, the Messiah is a political figure. He's a political and even military figure, right? So the Messiah is a first of all, he's not the son of God. The Messiah is a man in the Jewish tradition. They're expecting a man, not a deity. And it's also important that in Jewish tradition, any Jew can be the Messiah. You don't know. It's not, the Messiah is not going to be prospectively announced from heaven. Rather, he's going to be retrospectively recognized as the Messiah after he wins. And what does winning mean here? It means that the Messiah defeats Rome. This is what Jews in the first century were expecting. They were expecting the Messiah to arrive to defeat the Roman oppressor, right? Liberate the Jews and all of the oppressed pagans or polytheists in the Mediterranean, right? And then the Jews would save everybody. You know, the Messiah would save everybody by blessing everyone with good government under the law of Moses. This is what the Jews were waiting for. They were waiting for an ethical warrior saint who would defeat the Romans in the field of battle, overthrow oppressive government, and institute a new golden age under the law of Moses. Right? So who's the Messiah? Well, you don't know until it's over. You don't know, because anyone can be the Messiah, and the way to recognize the Messiah is to ask yourself, well, who liberated everybody? Has it happened yet? If it hasn't happened yet, then the Messiah hasn't come. If everybody has been liberated and we are now all living in peace under the law of Moses, then whoever achieved that, that's the Messiah. So it's a retrospective judgment, and it has nothing to do with this Christian concept of mystical salvation, you know, the forgiveness of sins and the granting of eternal life for those who accept the Messiah, you know, and all of this stuff about the Messiah becoming the sacrificial victim of an expiatory sacrifice officiated by the Godhead, right? This has nothing to do with the Jewish expectation, absolutely nothing. So the entire theology that the Christian movement was preaching was obviously rejected by the Jews because it had nothing to do with their own messianic tradition, right? So that part of how we understand history makes sense. The Jews did reject the messianic claim for Jesus. But the other idea that we see in the Gospels, which is that the Jews supposedly rejected the message of love, well, that's nonsense, because we know that the message of love came from Hillel originally, and we also know that the Jews ended up agreeing with Hillel, and they turned him into the new establishment. So obviously the Jews did not reject the message of love, which is not original with Jesus. It's original with Hillel. They adopted the message of love, right? But they rejected the messianic claim for Jesus. So what needs to be corrected here is this tradition that Christians have been transmitting century after century, that somehow the Jews were not interested in Jesus's message of love. They were very interested, because Jesus was one of many rabbis who was preaching the message of love that came from Hillel. And it was very popular among the Jews, so popular that they ended up institutionalizing it in the Mishnah. Okay? It's very important to get this context straight. And so that's what we discuss in the article. We do it with great detail, relying on the historical sources and also on scripture, so that people can see that this is the interpretation that resolves all of the apparent contradictions. And I have to say one more thing. The obvious question here is, if the Jews did not reject the message of love, why are they represented in the Gospels as rejecting the message of love, and then even pressuring the Roman governor to execute Jesus because they want to reject that message? That's what the Gospels do, right? This is the representation we see in the Gospels. But the reality, in my view, is that in the late first century, which is when the Gospels were written, the Christian movement was trying very hard to distinguish itself from Judaism. Okay? They were trying very, very hard to say, we are not like the Jews. And so Jesus had to be represented as someone in opposition to Judaism, because Christianity had actually developed as a Greek movement, right? So the Jews rejected the messianic claim for Jesus, but many, many, many Greeks, and then also many Romans, accepted it. That's a very interesting thing. Why were Greeks and Romans adopting the claim of a Jew to be the Jewish Messiah? They were Greeks and Romans. What did they care, right?
Yeah.
But the way to understand this is that in the ancient world, in the ancient Mediterranean, in the first century before Jesus, in the first century of the current era, the Jews were proselytizers. They were selling their religion to the Greeks and the Romans. They were converting thousands of Greco-Romans. The Greco-Romans were very interested in Judaism. Why? Because the Roman military aristocracy was oppressing everybody. Okay, they were a fascist ruling elite that was, based their entire political economy on war and on bringing slaves back from the wars. And they were very cruel. Remember that, the Romans even thought that, it's incredible to say it, but they even thought that watching a human being get eaten by an African beast was entertainment, like going to the movies, or watching two human beings fight to the death, and spill their blood in front of the audience at the Colosseum and other amphitheaters. They thought this was like going to the movies. So they were a psychopathic ruling elite, and they were causing enormous suffering to everybody in the Mediterranean. So think about it. The Jews, in their own tradition, they see themselves as establishing their own special body of law in the wake of a slave revolt, right? The Israelites had been slaves of the Pharaoh in Egypt, and they had emancipated themselves in a revolt that was organized by God, right? And then once in freedom in the Sinai desert, God gave them a new law so that they would never be oppressed again. So that whole story of the slave revolt and the laws to protect ordinary people, that was very exciting to the peoples of the Mediterranean who were being oppressed by the Romans. So they were flocking to the synagogues, getting very excited about Judaism, converting by the thousands and thousands. And that's also what Jesus was doing. Like many other rabbis, Jesus was preaching to the non-Jews and trying to convert the non-Jews. This was not special in Jesus. All of the rabbis were doing this. But Jesus was especially successful converting Greeks for reasons that we will discuss in a different article and in a different live podcast. Jesus was very, very successful converting Greeks to his movement, and he was not successful converting Jews. So the Jesus movement became a Greek movement. And in the late first century, when it became obvious to the Greek Christians that they would never convince the Jews, and they had this tremendous controversy with the Jews, must have been very uncomfortable for the Christians, because if you're a Greek and you're saying Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, and the Jews are saying, no, he wasn't, well, that's a tremendous prestige problem for you, and it's a tremendous logical problem for you, because now you are forced to say that you, the Greek, know better than the Jews who is the Jewish Messiah. That's a difficult position to be in. So what the Greek Christians, the Greco-Roman Christians ended up doing is they ended up claiming that the Jews didn't understand their own scripture, and that's why they had rejected Jesus. That's why they had failed to recognize that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. This is what became the Christian argument. So in order to do that, in order to represent the Jews as disconnected from the true meaning of Judaism, right? This is what the Christians ended up saying. They had to represent the rabbinical establishment as uniformly opposed to the love idea that Jesus was preaching. So they had to erase the school of Hillel from their representation of the first, and imagine the Jewish community as if they were uniformly Shammaites, followers of Beit Shammai, and they had to represent Jesus as the only preacher of love within the Jewish community, which then, because the Jews don't understand Judaism in the Christian interpretation, they had all rejected Jesus, who really did understand Judaism in the Christian interpretation. And this is what explains why, in the gospel interpretation, this is what explains why Christianity became a Greek movement rejected by the Jews. Okay, it's a complicated story, but once you look at all the sources simultaneously, it shines through, right? The difficulty for Christians is that Christians are not that interested in everything else that was happening in the first century or in the first century before Jesus. They're mostly interested in reading the Gospels and in treating the Gospel and other New Testament documents as supposed historical testimony. And they tend to do that uncritically because, of course, they have a religious commitment. They have a confessional commitment when they're reading the New Testament. So, understandably, they're not that interested in the rest of the sources, which might challenge the interpretations that are necessary for Christian faith. So I can see why this controversy has persisted our day. But if we're doing scientific historiography, then we need to consider skeptically all of the documents. We can't have religious commitments that make us favor one tradition over the other. We simply have to look at all of the documentation to try to reconstruct what was happening in the first century. And the Roman sources are particularly eloquent here, because the Roman sources are very clear that the Roman aristocracy was very worried about the Jewish movement, and they were very worried that the Jews would convert everybody and the Roman Empire would disappear. They were worried that the Roman Empire would become Jewish. And you need to understand that context to see what was happening in the dispute between Jews and Christians, and how Christianity became very useful to Rome in their fight against Judaism. In fact, Christianity ended up becoming the official religion of Rome, and the empire survived. It did not become Jewish. Well, it became Jewish in a sense when it became Christian, but it didn't become truly Jewish. So Christianity became very, very useful to Rome because Christianity developed as an anti-Semitic movement, because the argument in the Gospels is that the Jews murdered Jesus. So even though the Romans execute Jesus, the Gospels put the responsibility on the Jews because they represent this Jewish multitude pressuring the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, to execute Jesus, and they represent Pontius Pilate as no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do. Well, I'm only going to do it because you people are so mad and you're insisting that I do it, but I really don't want to do it. So the Gospels end up putting all the responsibility, all the moral responsibility, on the Jewish multitude that allegedly wanted to execute Jesus. Right. So we will talk more about this entire context in future articles. I just wanted to, what I wanted to do in this article and also in this live stream is to restore Hillel as the original father of Western ethics, because Hillel's teaching not only transformed Judaism, it transformed the entire West, because Jesus also preached the message of love that came from Hillel. And that became lodged within Christianity as the basis of Christian ethics. So all of Western ethics comes from Rabbi Hillel. And that's why I think he is the most influential Jew of all time, because you cannot have Western civilization without Western ethics. The only reason we have modern Western democracies is that Hillel's golden rule, what we call the golden rule, is Hillel's paraphrase of Leviticus 19:18. That's the golden rule. And we call it the golden rule because it generates all of Western ethics. So given that comes from Hillel, he is the author of Western civilization as an ethical system as we still know it today.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, this needs much more discussion in the next live, maybe. And I want to also, because in the course you mentioned also a lot more about this with Pablo spreading Christianity, right?
What about Paul? You were saying something about Paul.
Pablo.
Yes, that's Pablo. In English, it's Paul. Paul.
Okay, sorry. Okay, yeah. So he was like, you said in the course that this needs a lot more deep depth to analyze this, but as he was maybe recruited by the elites of the Romans.
Oh, okay. We will talk about that. Yeah, we will talk about that in a separate article. But yeah, Paul, just very briefly to foreshadow what we're going to be talking about, in his own letters. So the letters of Paul to his followers are the earliest documents of the Christian tradition. Those were written, the first ones were written in the 50s of the first century, and before the Gospels, before everything else. And in those letters, Paul explains that before he preached in the name of Jesus, he was preaching, before he preached in the name of Jesus, he was employed by the temple police, the temple in Jerusalem. And as an agent of the temple police, he was persecuting the Jesus movement in the first stage of his life. He was trying to get the apostles arrested and or killed, the friends of Jesus. So this is something that Paul confesses about himself, and it's also mentioned in Acts of the Apostles, which is not really the life of the apostles, it's the life of Paul, right? So by his own testimony, Paul was an agent of the temple police, and he was in charge of trying to arrest and or kill the friends of Jesus. Now, the temple was a Roman institution. It looked like a Jewish institution, but it was really a Roman institution. Why am I saying that? Because Jerusalem was conquered by the Romans in the year 63 before Jesus. And after that conquest, the Romans purged the temple, which is to say they killed the high priests who were not, who didn't want to collaborate with the Romans to oppress the Jews, and they allowed to remain and live only those pre-selves to collaborate with Rome against the Jews. Okay, and from that point forward, the temple police and the Romans would appoint and remove the high priest of the temple. They would do that themselves. So it really became a Roman institution, and the temple police was used to repress the Jewish population. In the first stages of the Roman occupation, it wasn't much of an occupation. There weren't many Roman soldiers in Judea. What the Romans would do is they would rely on the corrupted temple police to repress the Jews. Okay, so if Paul was working for that temple police, according to his own testimony, then he was a Roman policeman. And in fact, Paul says that in a separate letter, Paul says that he was a Roman citizen by birth. And we know from all of our documentation that in the conquered populations, nobody was a Roman citizen except for members of the aristocratic class of the conquered population who corrupted themselves to become agents of Rome to oppress their own peoples. So if Paul was a Roman citizen by birth, working for the temple police, and also in his letter to the Philippians, he says that he has friends in the Praetorian Guard, which was the special group of Roman soldiers that really held power in Rome, right? They were the ones who killed and appointed emperors, right? So if he had friends in the Praetorian Guard, well, then he was a Roman policeman, right? And the implications of that are very important for what Paul preached and for what the Christian movement did to change politics in the first and second centuries. So, but we'll talk about that later. It's a very, very interesting topic, and I'll go into it in great detail. So I think we leave it here. The big conclusion today is to restore Hillel to his rightful place as the origin of Western ethics, and therefore everything good that came after him in Western civilization, including the development many centuries later of modern Western democracy, because modern Western democracy is the political expression of loving your neighbor as you love yourself. So if you love your neighbor as you love yourself, then he should have all the same rights that you have, not fewer, the same. And when you reach that legal conclusion that we should all have the same rights, well, then you have to produce democracy. It's the only way to honor that principle. For everybody to have their rights and liberties protected in a Bill of Rights that includes equal participation in the political system, right? That's the sort of the end point of the understanding that we have to love our neighbor as we love ourselves.
So, Francisco, to sum up what you just said, to paraphrase a little bit, is Jesus was not the father of democracy or values, but a follower of Hillel, who was really the founder and the first one to impose Jesus.
That's right. Jesus was one of many rabbis preaching the views of Beit Hillel. Now, that doesn't mean Jesus was not a great man. I think he was a great man. He had a huge impact on world history. He was a tremendous human being. But it's difficult to figure out exactly what he did, because the Gospels are not historical documents. The Gospels are documents of Christian propaganda, Greek Christian propaganda that was trying to ruin the prestige of the Jewish movement in order to defend that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah. Right? So it was a Greek movement claiming to be following the Jewish Messiah. And in order to sustain that claim, they needed to ruin the prestige of the Jewish movement, because the Jews had rejected Jesus as the Messiah. So in order for the Christian movement to have intellectual stability, they needed to say that the Jews didn't understand Judaism, and that's why the Gospels became such which then makes it difficult, not impossible, but it makes it difficult to reconstruct what the historical Jesus was actually doing. But we will talk more about that later.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone. Like, subscribe, comment, and share it with everyone so this message can get louder and we can spread this message.
Yeah, exactly. Don't forget to subscribe, because that raises the prestige of the channel, and that's very good for us. Well, the YouTube channel. Let me tell them we have a YouTube. For those of you who are listening on Substack, we have a YouTube channel in English now that you may want to check out. We will be putting the link to that also in the article. I will be doing that later today. So check out our English language YouTube channel, subscribe, share it, like it. And if you're listening to us in Substack or on other platforms, please help sharing the article too, because the careful, reasoned argument is in the article. The sources are there. And those who may want to dispute anything in that article, or anything that I said in this podcast, rather, need the article so that they will know exactly which claims of mine they need to go fight against, and what sources am I using, and what do they say, right? And as I always say to my audiences, the best thing you can do is go try to refute me. This is how we make progress. So don't believe anything I say. Receive everything with great skepticism, and then go try to prove me wrong. And this is how we all make progress. Thank you very much, everybody. And I'll see you in the next live stream next week.